Hey, I'm Hunter from SkillThrive, and in this video, I'm going to show you how to create a grid system in your React project. Now, if you don't know what a grid system is, it's essentially a way to base a design off of a grid layout. So for example, I'm here in Figma, which is a prototyping tool, and you can see here I have the SkillThrive website, and this is in a 12 grid system. Now you can see I'm basing a lot of the design elements off of this grid. So for example, this card is 4 columns wide on a desktop, and I'm going to carry that same concept over into my code. So this is just a quick overview of what a grid layout is, just in case you don't know what one is. Now, I'm going to do a couple things different here in this project, and I'm not going to go line by line and show you how to write the code for the grid system. Instead, I'm going to give you a base project that you can then copy, and then I'm just going to explain some of how it is built, and then show you an example. That way, it doesn't get into the weeds and get too boring. Okay, so first off, check out the grid starter here in the bottom of the description. And once you have that, you should be able to open it up. And what you want to do is come over here and click on Fork in Code Sandbox, and it'll create a new project for you based off of that starter project that I supplied. Now what we can do is come over to Components, into Layout. You can see here that I have 4 components here, and these are essentially just like a starting point for a grid system layout. Now, as your project grows or expands, or maybe your needs are a little bit different, you can add more components or tweak things, pass in different props, and that's why I like to build this myself, because it grows and expands with my actual individual needs, instead of using something like Material UI, which is really great and has a lot of components, but a lot of stuff that is in that I don't really need to use. And it can just come overwhelming when you're trying to learn and build your projects, or at least that's my opinion. Now, the first thing I made here is the grid component. Now, once you have that here, essentially what you want to do is we defined a constant called grid, which is a styled component. And this is going to be a styled div tag. And in here, between the backticks, is where we write our CSS. And this is just standard CSS. Now, in order to define the grid, you first have to write display grid, which is what we did here. And the next thing we want to do is define the columns in this grid. Now, you'll see here that we have this 1FR unit and 1FR unit on the left and right. And what this is, if you've never heard of an FR unit, it's a unit that takes up and looks at the space that's available and decides on how much space is available, and then will fit responsively to what is available. So for example, you'll see here in the middle, we have these 12 columns, and I'm passing in a min-max value. Now the minimum, the smallest that a column can be, is just going to be generated for us, and that's how we can pass in the auto property here. Now the max value, the second one here, the 4.2 rem, is going to be essentially like a max width for our content. Now typically on websites, or at least websites that are like marketing websites or blogs or things like that, the content only will expand to a certain amount before the rest of it is just white space. And you'll see that here, like for example on SkillThrive's website, that the content, even though this is a really big screen, it's only fitting here the max width of 1440 pixels. So that is what essentially we are doing here by calling these 12 columns and then setting a max size on them. Now the next one is setting how tall you want the rows. Now I like to set this to max content, which sets the rows to the largest item that's in the row. So for example, if the largest item in a row is 300 pixels, that row is going to be a max content of 300 pixels. So next up is the gap. Now gap is the spacing between grids and columns. Now you have a top and bottom, left and right, and the way you can define that is by just passing in like this, like you would for padding or anything else. So the top and bottom gap is going to be 2 rem, and the left and right is going to be 2 rem. Now you might have noticed too that I'm passing in something called props here, and this props is going to see if I pass in a prop called gap default. And all this is gives me a little bit more flexibility if I ever want to change the default values here, or the fallback of 2 rem. So if I pass in this gap default and set it to 1 rem and 2 rem, it's going to have a top and bottom of 1 and then a left and right of 2. So it just gives me a little bit more flexibility when I'm using my components in my project. Now margin is actually really similar to gap. Here you can see that I have a a default of 0, but I also gave myself the ability to pass in a margin default prop in case I wanted to override this 0 here. All right, so next up, I have some breakpoints here, or media queries. Now what these do is once I hit a specific point on my screen, I want it to apply different styles. And the first thing I want to do is I want to go away from a 12 column layout and go to a 6 column layout. So you can see here at the medium breakpoint, and this is coming from the theme variables that I set in my styles. So if we come in here and just look at this themes, you can see here that I'm exporting something, an object here, and one of the values in this object is called breakpoints, and each of these has two values, small and medium. And medium is just a string, so it says only screen and max width 70 rem. So that's just a standard something that you'd write in a media query. So instead of writing that each time, I can just pass it in here as a prop that looks at that theme object. And then it just essentially means at media, only screen, max width 70 rem. So once it hits 70 rem or less, it's going to apply these styles. So what we want to do, like I said, is set up a 6 column max width, and then I'm also going to have a left and right margin of 2 rem. Then I'm going to change the gap to 1 rem and margin to 0, but also give me the ability to pass in some props called gap medium or margin medium in order to override these fallback default settings here. And essentially we did the same thing here for these small screens, but we made the margin left and right a little bit smaller, and we needed to change the property names for gap small and margin small. Okay, so then we just exported this so we can use it in our project. And the next thing I wanted to do is I went ahead and created a full width section. So let's go ahead and open this up. And now this component is intended to be within a grid component. So the grid component lays out our initial, our grid. And what we want to do is we want to tell this full width section how much of that it should actually take up, and then also provide a grid system within that. So you're essentially nesting your layouts here, or your grids. So in order for it to tell this how much space you should take in the grid component, we first need to define the grid column. Now this first value is the grid column start. So we're saying, hey, start on the first row and span all the way across the 14 that is available in the grid, hence a full width section. Now, again, I said I wanted to use grid within here. So in order to do that, I needed to say, hey, we need to use display grid. And I just defined the same columns that I did when I was writing the grid here. So you can see here at the top, the grid columns, 1FR, repeat 12, min max, auto, 4.2 rem, and then the right column of 1FR is the same for the full width. And that's because I want that to share the same layout, so my components within this max width can be based off of that grid as well. So essentially everything here is exactly the same as the grid, but instead we have to tell this how much space it should take up. You can see here that we want it to span all 8 columns on the medium. And we also, because we're not changing in small, it's just going to inherit the medium here for small as well. Okay, so that's the full width section. The next one is the max width section. Now remember, I set up those 12 columns in the middle to be a max width of like around 1440 pixels based off of this min max here that I set in the grid. Now, in this case, what we want to do is we only want the max width section to be in those 12 columns. So what we do is we say start on column 2 and span across the 12. Then we essentially did the same thing where we defined the columns here in the middle. So you can see here that we're saying min max, auto, and then 4.2 rem. And the gap and margin is the same story. We're just passing in some props here as an a possible value, and then having the fallbacks. And then here on the medium, we need to say start on 2, span on 6, and we just have our props for our medium and small screens as well. Okay, so the last one I built is the row component. Now the row component is a really simple component that really what it serves the purpose of doing is to make sure, like when we're using elements in our design, we don't have to write these media queries of telling it, at media, blah, 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 this is how much space you should take up. So instead, what we can do is we can use a row component, pass in some props, so SD, ED, SM, EM, SS, and ES as props to define the start and end of that element. Now, in this case, this row is going to be a style div, and you'll see here that I have values called grid column start and grid column end. Now, before, what we were doing, let's look here on the grid component, or actually not the grid component, but the full width component. We had grid column, the first value being start, the last one being end. Now, this is a shorthand way of writing grid column start, grid column end. And the reason I just decided to break them up here into separate properties is I just think it's a little easier to understand what's going on. So in trying to fit all this logic into one row, I'm breaking it up a little bit. So here you can see that grid column start, I have this prop called SD. Now this stands for start default, and this one stands for end default. So if this isn't passed in, the fallback is going to be 1 and then 12. So it's just going to fill the full width of the component. And essentially we have the same thing here. So on medium screens, I have start medium, end medium, then a fallback of 1 and 6. And then here on the small screens, we have start small, end small. So that might be a lot for you to like really comprehend here by just looking at it. So let's actually start to use these components in an example so you can see firsthand how you can actually use these in a project. So let's come into our app.js file here. And the first thing I want to do is I just want to go ahead and get rid of this div here because we're going to be actually using the components that we just covered. Now we're actually going to be using and creating styled components here as well. So let's go ahead and import styled from styled components. And we also want to go ahead and import the grid, full width, section, max width, and row. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so now that we have the components here imported, let's go ahead and start building the actual things that want to be rendered to the screen. So usually if I would define these elements in a separate component, but just to keep this project simple, I'm going to be creating style components within this app.js file. So the first one I want to do is I want to create a header component. So we'll say const header equals styled. And before we would do something like styled div or styled h1 or something like that. But what you can also do is pass in a component as a styled component. So for example, this header tag, I want to be a full width section. I want it to take up the full width of whatever the screen size is. And just like we did when we were writing our components before, we do 2 backticks and we can write some custom CSS right here. Now let's go ahead and just give this some padding. So padding for rem, 1.5 rem on the left and right. And I'll just give it a background color so you can see it on the screen here. So background color, light coral, and we'll go ahead and save that. So now let's go ahead here and in our app, we have our return. The first thing I want to do is lay out our initial grid. So we'll just go ahead and define that here. And then I can go ahead and render out the header. So header, just like this. So let's go ahead and save this. And what I want to do is come into, you can come into view, appearance, and let's see, toggle preview, or the shortcut is Shift Command D. So that just hides and opens it. Then I'm going to come over here and click on this button to open this app in a new project. And it's going to build our project here. So you can see the header here is at the top. So let's go ahead and right click and inspect this. And I'm just going to zoom in here on the elements here in our DevTools. You'll see that our header is, in fact, if we expand this, it is here, right here. It's this section. Now, what if you wanted it to be a header instead of a section tag? Well, it's really easy to change that with styled components. What we can do is pass in a component called as, or excuse me, not a component, but a prop, and then say what we want this to be. So in this case, we want it to be a header. So if we save that, it's now going to render as a header instead of a section. So we'll need to refresh this, expand this, and you'll see now that instead of a section, we have a header. So this is just really important if you want to write nice, clean, semantic HTML. Okay, so now that we have that, I'm going to go ahead and just hide this again. So Shift Command D, so give us some more space here. And what I want to do now is I want to create a nav here within this header. So let's go ahead now and create this styled component. So const nav equals styled, and this nav is going to be a styled row. So remember, this is the component that we imported right here. So this nav is also going to have link tags. So what we want to do is go ahead and style the link tags here. Now, if you ever use something like SAS, you know about nested styles. So what's really cool about this is that I can just, instead of passing in a class name, I can just say on the link tags in this nav component, we want to add some styles. So let's do margin right, 1 rem. So it's going to save that. Okay, and in this header, we can go ahead and use that nav component. And in here, we're going to have some links. Now, typically, instead of just a link tag, I would be using something like React Router or Reach Router. But just for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to write a link tag here with an href that doesn't lead anywhere. And we can go ahead and pass in some text for that link tag. Okay. And remember, this nav is going to be rendered as a div, but it's much better for HTML to actually, instead of using a div, use a nav element. So just like we did for the header, we can say render this as a nav element. Okay, so let's go ahead and save that. If we come into our project and refresh, actually we didn't need to refresh, but let's go ahead and open this. Inside the header, we can see our nav and we can see our tags. Now, remember on this row that we created, or at least that we covered, we have these props, ED, SD, SM, so on and so forth. And this defines how much space this should take up. So on this nav, right now it's taking up the first row and then 12 columns and then 1, 6, 1, and 6. So let's come back into our app here. And what we want to do is we want it to start on the second row and then span the 2. So essentially, or span the 12. So essentially it's going to act like a max width column. So to do that, we can say SD. We also want to do ED, SM, EM, SS, and then SE. We can pass in values here for the numbers. So this is going to be equal to 12, or excuse me, 2. So start default, end default would be 12. This is going to be 2. This is going to be 6 columns, but we want it to span. This is going to be 2, and then this is going to be 6. So if we save that now, those will be passed over into our styled component for the row. And you'll see here that now this nav was over here, and now it's been pushed over because it is starting on the second row. So you can see here, once we highlight this div, that you can see that it's starting on the second row and then spanning these 12 right here. Okay, so now that we did that, the next thing we want to do is just do one more example here, and that is for a content section. Now the content section is also going to be a styled component, but it's going to be a styled max width section. So we do const content equals styled, and we'll pass in that max width section. And we'll just do our 2 backticks. We'll give this some padding just to give it some size so we can actually see it in our application. So 10 rem on the top and bottom, and then 5 rem on the left and right. And we'll also give it a background color so we can see it as well. So that just will be a light blue. Okay. So now that we have that, let's go still within this grid underneath this header and create our content, or not create, but use our content styled component. Okay, and then we'll go ahead and give it a closing tag here. And here, remember that this max width section renders out as an HTML section. So in order to change that to something like a main tag, we can just go ahead and write main. So now it's going to be a main tag. And in here, we're going to use a row. And the reason I am just using row is because I'm not going to be changing I'm not going to be creating any of these these props. I'm not passing them in. I'm just going to be using the default ones that come with this row component. So that's why I'm not creating another styled component here. And in here, I can just go ahead and paste in some filler text. Save that, come back into our project. And now you can see if we open up our project, we have that header tag, which is a full width section, which we rendered as a header. We have the main tag, which is a max width section that we rendered as a main tag. And in here, because we're using the max width section, we have a grid that, that this row can be based off of. If we go ahead and expand this, you can see that we're saying start on row 1 and then span 12. And in here, you'll see that you have the p tag. So let's go ahead and just to show you how this is also responsive, you can see everything sizes proportionally based off of all of those properties that we defined when we were creating our grid system. So hopefully this video gave you a really good idea of how to start creating a grid system for your React projects and why it's a really good idea possibly for your project to do so you can actually create a very nice design system as well when you're designing your site or your app. Now, if you're still confused, be sure to drop a comment in the question and I'll be sure to answer as many as possible because I want to make sure you guys are really understanding the benefits of creating a grid system like this. Now, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing, and be sure to check out our other design and development tutorials on our website as well as our YouTube channel. Again, I'm Hunter from ScoThrive, and I'll see you in the next video.